Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. My name is Steph and I am your host, coming to you from a balmy National Centre for Writing in the heart of Norwich City of Literature. You're in for a treat today as we hear from novelist Joanna Miller, who will share her insights into writing strong female characters in historical fiction. Joanna studied English at Exeter College in Oxford and later returned to the university to train as a teacher. After 10 years in education, she set up an award-winning poetry gift business. She is an alum of our Escalator New Writing Fellowships, which helped her to transform her debut novel, The Eights, from a first draft to its final form. The Eights tells the story of Oxford University's first admitted female students and the unlikely, life-affirming friendships they form in their time there. Joanna sat down with NCW programme producer Katie Cooper to discuss her debut novel and the importance of exploring women's voices and experiences in historical fiction. They also touch on her research process, writing about friendship and found family, and the inspiration behind the characters and plot in The Eights. So without further ado, I am delighted to hand over to Katie in conversation with Joanna Miller.
So welcome to this episode of The Writing Life. We're delighted to welcome back to the National Centre for Writing the novelist Joanna Miller to talk about her new book, The Eights. So welcome back to NCW, Joanna. You did our Escalator programme in 2023, didn't you?
I did, yes. And I have returned a couple of times since. I came last summer and spent a week writing in the cottage in the garden, which was great.
And that's the best time to come, actually, in the summer. We're looking forward to lots of events in the garden, so maybe you'll join us for some of those. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about this incredible novel, The Eight, which you started during the Escalator programme, is that right?
No, I completed it pretty much during the programme, yeah. So I think I had around 30,000 words when we began, maybe a bit more, maybe up to 50 or 60, but it was not in a pretty good state. I had an agent who I just had got just before the programme began, but there was still a lot of work to do, and the majority of that work was done on Escalator with the help of my mentor, Michael Doncourt, and my agent. But it was a really hard-working and productive time for the novel.
And it's a novel which is so sort of dense in historical research that I can see that must have been a really sort of complicated thing. How did you immerse yourself into this world of The Eights?
Well, I'm not a historian, so I was learning as I went along as to what would be the most useful things for me to do. And I was still researching up until I was writing the acknowledgements after having sold the novel and edited it a couple of times with UK and US editors. So it was an ongoing process. I began with reading up everything I could find online to do with the first women at Oxford in 1920 and the history behind the fight to get recognition and to be able to study alongside the men. And that was mostly through resources that I found in the Bodleian Library, the Oxford Bodleian Library. Luckily for me, and the reason why I decided to write about those women was because they just celebrated 100 years of women matriculating and getting degrees. That happened about 1 year before I began Escalator. And that's what kicked off the idea for the novel. And Oxford University commissioned quite a lot of research, including asking for the ex-women's colleges to upload all their treasures, their documents relating to the first women and put them into one united section in the library under the project title Education and Activism. So I had a huge lot of resources that I could read in lockdown because it still was very difficult to get out in 2021. And so I began there. And then I started to read memoirs and social histories relating to Oxford. I started with Testament of Youth by Vera Britton, and I was lucky enough to be able to get back into the Bodleian and actually have a look at some of their resources. So some of the books that were written by some of the first women, including a woman called Annie Rogers, who features in the novel as one of the tutors because there are many cameos. But one of the main things I did was I went back to Oxford once I was allowed to to after lockdown and walked around it nearly every weekend for a couple of years with my dog and husband sometimes with my kids. And I would walk the steps of the characters from the colleges to the various buildings, soaking them up from the outside and sometimes from the inside too. So I was writing a chapter about the Oxford Union. I got a tour of the Oxford Union. They were very kind and took me around and showed me the inside of the old Union Library. So there was a lot of hands-on research.
That research lends itself to how sort of evocative of that particular time. Thinking about Oxford's almost a character in this book. It's not just a backdrop. It's always doing something. It's always somehow influencing the action. How did the Oxford that you were discovering through your research fit with the Oxford that you remembered from being an undergraduate at Exeter College, was it?
Well, it was, and such a good question, because I was trying to capture how I felt when I arrived at Oxford. My parents didn't go to university. I didn't know much about university, although I did grow up in Cambridge. So I was, to a certain extent, prepared for what it was like to live within this sort of collegiate system. But I was on the outside. And I was completely overwhelmed by the buildings, by the traditions, by the lifestyle. I found it incredibly romantic and was completely consumed by it, living in a bedroom on Turl Street that had one window that looked into the quad on the inside and one onto the road outside, that was in a college that had been around for nearly 700 years. So it was pretty overwhelming, and I tried to capture that in the novel. It was one of the things that I wanted to show, was how the influence of the buildings on new students, and how you feel suddenly a part of this incredibly elite but also very civilized and intellectually productive community. And to be honest, having studied photographs of what it was like in 1920 and thinking about what it was like when I was there in 1987, it really hadn't changed that much at all. I was at a former men's college, but they'd only been taking women for about 7 years, and it was still very much a man's college that just happened to have a few women in it. And that's how the university feels in the eights, if you recall. The women feel as if they're guests at a man's university, and the quota of women is kept down to a fifth, and was for many years after 1920, when women first arrived. So they were maintained and suppressed, and it felt a little bit like that even in 1987. The men were dominant. There were page 3 of the Sun was posted up in the JCR sometimes, and we had a male scout and lived on a staircase that had men and women living on it, and the toilets were 2 floors upstairs. So if you wanted to go to the loo in the middle of the night and you lived on the ground floor or the second floor, you were still going up 2 or 3 flights, and you might have to do that if you wanted to go in the middle of the day and have a shower or whatever. And it was the male scout would come into the bedrooms in the morning and open the curtains, and when we said we didn't want this to happen, he was very angry and said he'd been doing it for many years and that was how things were done. And we made a complaint to the bursar, and we were told that if we didn't let him get on with his job, he would resign and then he'd never find another job anywhere else, and he was nearly 60 and that would be on us. Wow. So that was 1987. But I have been back. That was 67 years after the 8s were there. But I have been back recently, many times actually, and it's very different now. It's 50-50 men and women. The bedrooms are ensuite. It's very much a sense of equality between men and women. Women are becoming the heads of colleges. Still haven't got a head of the university yet that has been a woman, but there is a sense of the feminine and the female in the way the colleges, I think, look at things and do things. There's gender equal toilets and things like that. It's very much moved on, but I wouldn't say it's there yet.
And was that an important consideration for you in writing this book? Did it feel like a sort of feminist enterprise?
Oh, definitely. It definitely did, yes. I felt that this story hadn't been told. I was amazed it hadn't been told, actually. And so were a lot of people who found out about the book, my editor, I think, included, that no one had thought of, or seen what was going on at the time, post-war, when women were struggling to get recognised, when they'd been working during the war, but had those jobs taken away from them afterwards, and they didn't want to go backwards. They wanted to move forward in education and in their careers. They also couldn't rely on marriage because they were, this classic 1 million women hunting for husbands, as the famous Daily Mail headline said. And I think through what was going in Oxford seemed, I think, in some ways ways like a microcosm of what was going on in society as a whole in terms of what was happening to women.
And that's a really key part of this book, I think, is that several of the characters make reference to that idea of not being able to get a husband, or because so many men have been lost, there's no way that I'll be able to get a husband. I've got to stick in here and make an alternative for myself. Do you think that this sort of historical fiction is a really good place to give voice to those sorts of inner conversations? Because historically, I guess, you wouldn't get so much of an inner monologue from a woman. You would get a woman as a player in somebody else's story. Did you think that it was important to set these women and their concerns centre stage?
Absolutely, yes, which is why I think I picked 4, because I felt there was so much to say and so many different views to represent that if I had 4 different women, I could come at it from different angles. I could therefore show the variety of jobs that women did during the war, their war experiences, their ambitions, and not everyone was the same. As Vera Brittain writes in Testament of Youth, she still did feel that some women were there to find husbands or treated Oxford as a finishing school. But I was trying to capture, I think, the broad spread of experience.
And that works so well across these 4 characters who are so compelling. And so I think it was Tracy Chevalier said that she felt that she was friends with them. And I must say that I really felt that reading it. I felt like I would really get on with certain of your characters, like Otto. So do you want to tell us a little bit about those particular characters and I suppose what those 4 women were doing, what they were showing?
Yeah, sure. Otto is probably my favourite to write because she's the least like me. She does display some of the class prejudices of her time, and I was quite careful not to modernise them too much. They do have flaws and they do see things in the way that women in 1920 might have seen them. So she does, look down on some of the servants and bribe them with gifts, and she does make questionable comments about other women's appearance. But Otto is a very lively character who brings a lot of the humour to the novel. She's the daughter of an MP and an aristocrat, the youngest of 4 sisters. And through her, I wanted to explore how not every woman lost a brother or a fiancé in the war, and that I was interested in the experience of the First World War from the point of view of someone who just had sisters. I just thought it was a slightly different way of looking at it. And she is obsessed with mathematics, and she's unsettled. She's searching for something and can't quite find it, but she finds sort of peace of mind through calculations, and she gets a job as a nurse during the war and is sent without realising to what's seen as an easy job, nursing soldiers at Somerville College in Oxford. But she can't cope with it. It's too difficult. It causes her a great deal of trauma and stress. And she leaves that job and becomes a driver instead. So she drives around Oxford and she meets Miss Rogers, who we mentioned earlier, and she's inspired to return to Oxford to study mathematics later on. But she's quite cynical about Oxford, but she's also quite tough. So she doesn't take any messing around from some of the men who don't want her to be there.
And she's very much she has a sort of macho side, I think, Otto. I sort of think of her as being and I think that her connection to mathematics is particularly important there, right? That a lot of the other characters are doing more feminine subjects, perhaps as we might understand them, like English or history or languages. And I think that Otto doing maths feels very hard-headedly getting into the men's territory and not caring very much about it.
Yes, and she's had an offer of marriage from a friend. They're not in love, it's just would be a marriage of convenience, and her mother's angry with her for not having accepted that and deciding to go to Oxford, so her mother's not speaking to her, has gone off to America. And sort of difficult mothers and women, sort of young women seeking a found family is quite a strong theme, one thing that brings the women together on Corridor 8. But I think if it wasn't for Otto wanting these friendships to happen, they wouldn't happen at all, because she's the host, she's the one with the money, she's the one who sneaks in the alcohol and arranges a lot of their events. So she's pretty integral to the group, and for her I think it's the most unusual set of friends she's ever had compared to any of the others.
Because they're from such diverse backgrounds, right? And her sisters are almost bright young things, I think, that is mentioned, which of course we might recognise from some of Evelyn Waugh's novels. of this period, like Decline and Fall and maybe even the film Bright Young Things. But she's then brought into contact with these women who've had very different backgrounds. Like, for example, I was thinking of Marianne, the sort of quiet rectory girl with the big secret, which I don't really want to give away because it's such an integral part of the end of the book. But can you tell us a little bit about Marianne?
Yes, well, Marianne is a vicar's daughter, and those initially I thought, well, that might be a bit of a trope, but in my research showed that pretty much a lot of the girls were vicar's daughters because vicars had training in Latin and Greek, and in order to get into Oxford prior to 1920, you needed to have excellent Latin and Greek and pass exams in them, and the way that women were taught, just the standard wasn't good enough. So she's a vicar's daughter. Her father went to Oxford and he's wanted her to go. Her mother has died in childbirth, so she's his only child, and they are very close. She's a romantic. She adores the pre-Raphaelites and seizes every opportunity she can when she's in Oxford to look at some of the William Morris tapestries in Exeter College, or to look at the paintings in the Ashmolean, and has an encounter with someone, which we won't go into too much detail, looking at the murals in the Oxford Union Library. Yes. But she is a case of still waters run deep. She's a very sort of caring maternal figure, but highly intelligent. So she is the scholarship student of the war. And it's her being pushed over by a man at the beginning that is the inciting incident in the novel that brings them all together.
And I guess, sort of makes them realise what they're going to get from each other. It's a really establishing incident, isn't it? In which each character perfectly shows her personality going forward and the way that they're going to fit together into these little pieces.
As Beatrice says, Otto wouldn't like or speak to Marianne if she didn't live on the staircase, on the same, sorry, it's not staircase, on the corridor. The reason why I'm stumbling over staircase is that it was a staircase for so long. And it wasn't until right at the end of doing the edits after the novel that sold that I got into St Hugh's College and was able to look at some of the rooms and have a tour. And I saw that they lived on corridors, long corridors, which were built for purpose so that the principal could look down the corridor and make sure the women were behaving themselves. So it was changed from staircase 8 to corridor 8.
Because those women can't be trusted. And I do want to get back to talking about your beautifully researched rules, but let's introduce some of the others. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about Dora, because Dora, in lots of ways, has quite a lot in common with Vera Brittain, who you were talking about before, doesn't she?
She does, yeah. She is the Vera Brittain-inspired character in that she has a provincial background. She goes to boarding school. She has lost a brother and a fiancé, and her father is in a trade. He runs a factory. And Dora is the first character I wrote, and I realised that she was influenced by my research of Vera Brittain and what I'd read at the time. But she's also a local girl, so she lives in the same town as me. And when I was thinking about starting the novel and beginning with a character who was one of these first women, I was walking my dog in the World War I practice trenches in Ashridge Estate near my house. And I thought, these would be wonderful to bring into the book somehow, but they were dug up until 1918, so there would be a 2-year gap. So I thought, well, what would happen if a local girl fell in love with an officer cadet who come to dig one of these trenches, and then they met at Oxford later on? And so that's how Dora's story evolved. And in order to, I think, give her a reason to come and to have a character that was grieving, I felt that it was necessary for this fiancé to have died, and for her to be looking for something by returning, perhaps looking to find him in Oxford by going there as a form of tribute both to him and her brother. And Dora is the most unashamedly of all the characters looking for a husband. She feels that she is not as academic as the others and doesn't pass one of the exams that she's required to when she arrives, called a responsion, and that creates some issues in the novel ongoing. Something happens to Dora at the end, about a third of the way in at the beginning of the second term, because the novel covers 1 year, 3 terms, which turns everything upside down for all of the characters.
Yeah, but also provides, I suppose, a very interesting caveat perhaps to that Vera Brittain idea that everyone's story was tragic, every soldier was a hero, and everyone lost everyone in their lives. I always remember studying World War I and being really staggered to discover that actually for a lot of people, they didn't lose. They might know someone who lost someone, but it wasn't everybody's dad and everybody's brother and everybody's fiance. And I thought that you brought that out really, really beautifully. Sort of started to maybe not question, but to think about ideas about some of those men coming back, some of those men not being very nice, some of those men being quite sort of problematic in the way that they interact with the women in their lives. And I thought that was a real strength of the book, because it's quite easy, isn't it, to get to present the First World War in a certain way. So do tell me about Beatrice, who's a character who's really sort of imbued with that period. What we think of in the 1920s when we think of a woman is a suffragette, right?
Yes, well, her mother was a famous suffragette. So I was very interested in the idea of what it's like to live in the shadow of a famous suffragette, because when you start to research them, you realise that they have very, very strong characters. And of course, they must have done to forge ahead as they did. But some of them later on in the late 20s and early 30s actually became very right wing. And I was quite shocked by, some of the characters that developed after, women gained the vote and the WSPU was closed down. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to consider what it would be like to be the daughter of one of these women who expects a lot of her own daughter, who's fought for her emancipation, and that hence Beatrice feels quite neglected by her mother, yet in awe of her at the same time and irritated by her. So she's looking to develop friendship. She's looking for found family like many of the others. She's very interested in social injustice compared to the other three on Corridor 8. And I think that allowed me to sort of emphasize some of the issues that were going on at the time. And through Beatrice, I was able to talk about things like the construction of the memorial in Whitehall, and how, there were protests about it at the time, but they're never reported in the newspaper, about how the disabled and the people that had been released from prison as conscientious objectors, widows, etc., weren't taken care of. Yet a lot of money was put into this campaign for memorials and for there's the first Armistice Day that they had in November 1920, which we see in the novel. So I thought she was a very interesting way of tackling some of those issues. But she's also just really generous in spirit and enthusiastic about everything, which annoys her mother, but it allowed me to ask quite a lot of questions. And hence she opens and closes the novel because she's quite an observer and she's quite open-minded. And she stands apart from the others because she's 6 foot tall, and she struggles with finding women's clothes, and in fact isn't comfortable when she's forced to wear them. So we see a development in her character where she starts to change how she looks under the influence of people, particularly a woman that she meets at Oxford and has quite strong feelings for. And I think that that's true of what it's like to be at university. You do meet people who you admire and you want to be like, and sometimes it could be part of that experience, changing yourself, when you leave home for the first time.
And I loved that, because one of the things that I really love about that period is these incredible women like Radcliffe Hall, whose novel The Well of Loneliness you name check, who did look incredible in a 3-piece suit and did cut their hair and did sort of take on quite new, challenging, or like queer identities essentially, and were real trailblazers in the sense that they were, wearing a lovely suit, driving a nice car and taking women out in the West End. And I loved that for her. Once Beatrice started to evolve towards that, it really made me think of those women and those trailblazers.
But I also wanted to capture how her friends find it quite normal, and that they don't make a big deal about it, that they just say, oh, doesn't she look wonderful? She looks like Radcliffe Hall, and then carry on talking about something else. It's not a big deal for them, and she feels wonderfully accepted. So we see her character developing and evolving, her confidence growing. And she was a pleasure to write, actually. And I was, through her height, I was channeling part of my own experience experience. I had two friends at Oxford, lots of friends, but two special friends. One was an artist, one was a fellow English student, and one was 4'10" and one was 5 foot. Now you can't see me, but I'm 5'7" and I'm quite well built. So I would tower over these two friends, and I think that was partly what was on my mind when I was writing about how Beatrice is stared at and seems to sort of stand out, because I was always the tallest and, much larger than my friends walking along beside me. So,
and it raises all of those questions, doesn't it, about femininity and masculinity and what you feel you should look like, and especially as a woman, especially during this period, that sort of desire that you should somehow be fitting into a certain shape or a certain category or a certain way of looking and living. And I love the way that these characters feel so contemporary in that way, because they're quite willing to challenge quite a lot of what's expected of them.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's pretty much the whole movement of the novel, is about challenge and about, it's also about recovery too. And in recovering from war, in recovering from a society that has treated women unfairly, change is required, experimentation is required, and, people are required to push forward past, blockages. And as the epigraph in the novel says, it's a quote from Lucretia Mott, who's a US suffragette: "Any change must expect opposition because it shakes the very foundation of privilege." So that was on my mind all the time, even when I was writing about friendship issues, because these women are in recovery, society is in recovery. And I was very interested in how important solidarity is, and mutual understanding and determination in moving forward against, these privileges, this opposition.
And because there's these huge societal changes that you do sort of bring in through Beatrice and through her mother. I think you talk about the Sex Disqualification Removal Act and all of these sorts of different kinds of legislation that are starting to open up opportunities for women to move into the professions, to vote, to own property, to have their own money.
Yes, and Beatrice is one of the very first students of PPE. I've considered myself very fortunate when I was researching and realised that the first year of PPE was 1920, because that allowed me then to sort of demonstrate how women were slowly moving into the civil service, because that's what PPE was considered to do, was to be a degree that would prepare them for that. And this was a brand new thing, just as they had moved into medicine a couple of years before. So she's one of these women who lives on the cusp of this sense that actually everything is possible if you fight for it.
And that, I think that's what creates such a good connection between these women and perhaps female undergraduates now, is that sense of being that age and feeling that incredible, exciting possibility, but also the crushing sort of weight of doing yourself justice somehow, of doing it right, getting it right, making the right choices.
Absolutely, yes. I think you put your finger on it. They do put themselves under enormous pressure, each one of them for different reasons. Whether it's Marianne because she, wants to keep her scholarship and she wants to get a job as a teacher because she thinks she'll never marry. And if it's Dora who wants to live, remember and memorialise her brother and her fiancé. It's Otto who wants to prove that women can be a success of mathematics and she can stick at something because her mother says she can never stick at anything. And Beatrice proving to her mother that she is, has been worth the fight.
Which she does, actually, I think, rather nicely in the end. But they're sort of constrained as well within this system. One of the things that I really, really loved about this was that you'd gone and found the rules that they had to obey. And they're quite strange, some of them. Do you want to talk a bit about the rules that they're given when they first arrive and told that they must abide by?
Sure. Well, I must just say that I did go into the archives in St Hugh's College, so a lot of the ephemera that is in the novel, the lists of rules and some of the letters and notes and things like that, they're actually taken straight from there, so they are mostly real. And these rules were, I have to say, they weren't maintained. maintained for, by the end of the 20s. But when the women first arrived, they were there under obviously conditions. First of all, parents had to be happy that women would be their daughters would be safe if they sent them to Oxford. So they felt more comfortable if they lived in these colleges that looked a bit like hotels and were run on very strict rules, bells and roll call, etc. And also the university was happier and with the idea that women would not impact on men's education. So, for example, one of the rules was that men and women shouldn't talk before and after lectures because, we've brought these women in, but we mustn't let them, distract the men. So we had rules like you must not go punting with a man unless it's your brother. You must not go to a man's room unless it's your brother. You must not have afternoon tea unless you're in a group of 5 people, in a public space, and there must be other women with you. You're not allowed to drink alcohol. You're not allowed to go to public dances. You're not allowed to play certain mixed sports, hockey being one of them. They were allowed to play mixed tennis, and they had to get permission to go out after dinner. And if they did, they had to be wearing their cap and gown, and they had to be in by 11 p.m. And if they were in 5 minutes after 11 p.m., they were sent down often, or i.e. thrown out of the university. It was incredibly strict. And there's one story that I uncovered, which I do allude to in the novel, about Dilys Powell, the well-known film critic who's now passed away, but she was at Somerville in the early 1920s, and she was sent home for 2 terms in her 3rd year when she was meant to be revising for her finals, because she was caught climbing in over the wall at the back of the college, having been out for tea with her fiancé. And the Daily Mail caught wind of this, and it was on the front page, and she brought the college into disrepute, so she was sent away for 2 terms for doing that. They were the principals of the colleges were obsessed with keeping the reputations unblemished of the women and of the colleges. Otherwise, I think they feared that they would be kicked out or somehow crushed and would never move forward beyond this 1/5 that they were allowed. One in 5, no more than 1 in 5 should be a woman. So,
and that comes across really well because they're so worried about it, aren't they? That comes across from the principal, certainly, of St Hugh's, and of this fear that not so much that they want to necessarily be harsh on the students, but that they are terrified that this tiny, tiny advance might get taken away from them if they do one thing wrong.
Yeah, and it's all about impression, about how they're reported in the newspaper, what other people think. And when you compare those rules to the behaviour of men, when you think of Brideshead Revisited, for example, set at the same time, roughly, and the drinking that went on and the chaotic games and tricks and japes, etc., the lifestyles were completely different. Women weren't allowed to perform in plays. Men could, but if they had female parts, they had to get local actresses to come and play them. Yeah. So, women weren't allowed to join the Oxford Union until the 50s. A lot of societies, women weren't allowed to join, and if they wanted to, they had to get special permission. There was a mixed choir, so everybody joined the mixed choir, from what I can see from my research. The Bach choir, it's called. But yeah, they were very constrained. So of course, they're young people, they're going to break the rules. So that was a bit of the book that I really enjoyed writing about, was when and how they broke the rules. And Otto particularly encourages the others to do so by smuggling in alcohol. It was true that you could make an arrangement with a wine merchant to send unmarked packages to you at colleges. So that was fun. That was fun, thinking about how, they could possibly get into trouble.
Yeah, and it's interesting, though, because there are some male enablers. They do experience, as you've described, some sort of hostility from the male students who feel a bit funny and a bit threatened, evidently. But there are also some male enablers in the book who sort of really come through, and even some anonymous male enablers, which I think was the only part that brought me quite close to tears, those notes in the lecture. Can you talk a little bit about the male enablers?
In that particular lecture, Beatrice is tricked and sent to the wrong room by some male students. and turns up for a lecture on Russian history and is late. And she's humiliated by the lecturer, by the Don, and is sent out. As she's going out, another man comes in and past her and enters the room and isn't sent out. And as she goes, he makes humiliating remarks about how, Oxford isn't a finishing school and she shouldn't really be there. And she's absolutely furious. But the others encourage her to go back. And when she does go back the following week, it happens to be Valentine's Day. And she's handed something. She sits in the corner at the back, sort of hiding, gets there super early. And she's handed something by a couple of young men. And she daren't look at it because she thinks it's probably some horrible cartoon about her or something really vile. And actually, when the lecture starts, she looks down and someone's actually written out the lecture notes for her, and another has given her a freshly plucked snowdrop with a note that says "Take no notice," which is a little echo throughout the novel. I don't know if you noticed, but it's something that suffragettes used to pass out through the crowd during rallies, telling people that if there were interruptions, just to carry on listening. So yes, these are two of these unknown enablers, but there are two very lovely male characters. One is a friend of Dora's brother and tries to court Dora during the novel. He's not entirely successful. He allowed me to bring another college in, Jesus College, and he is his name is Frank Collingham, and he and his friends host the Eights quite a lot, take them to various events and host them on their college barge during College Eights. So it allowed me to show that, under the constraints of having a chaperone with you, you were allowed to go to male colleges and spend time with them and have tea. You were allowed to go on boating trips with them, etc. But yes, I was able to introduce a cast of chaperones who accompany characters to meet with these lovely young men.
And also add a little frisson of romance here and there.
Yes, there is. And good old Henry. I'm not going to say who he meets because I think that would give it away, but Henry meets one of the characters during a lecture around about halfway through the novel, and he is a wounded war veteran who very keen on women being at Oxford, and they meet up with him on several occasions, and there is a love interest with one of the more unexpected characters. And Henry, I think, for me, encapsulated everything that is decent and civilized in the Oxford students that I met. And I think that's all I'll say about him.
He's a lovely, soft, sort of generous man, isn't he, who perhaps has been quite humbled by some of his experiences in the war, but is really compassionate about other humans and about helping them and being sort of kind to these women that he's met, and really comes to enjoy their friendship, I think. Has a lot more time for them than some of the baying hordes that appear on occasion throughout the novel, leering over walls or out of windows, playing little tricks.
I wanted to show that there was a difference between the men that were at Oxford who'd come back, who'd left during the war and then returned, and there was more maturity about them than there was about the 18-year-olds who had arrived and had missed out on, the war. They'd been 16 in 1918, so they'd never actually been called up. So that was quite an interesting contrast to draw, not just in their behaviour, but how they looked as well. Otto can tell a veteran from just glancing at them. She doesn't need to know much else. She can just tell by the lines on their faces as to whether they've been to war or not. So he gave me a good opportunity to talk about that.
And I guess to talk about some of the other challenges that the war had brought in terms of men's lives and men's perhaps having to reappraise their own masculinity and think about what being a man is like and what's important, what makes a good man. And I thought that comes across really, really beautifully in characters like Henry. One of the things that I was really fascinated about this is a really lovely phrase that you use, a really lovely sort of story that you tell, which I thought leads in really nicely to thinking about this book as a piece of historical fiction. There's a moment where the characters are talking about ghosts, and they talk about ghosts having to have a certain historical status. Even, I think it's the ghost of Charles I or something. They say, oh, well, the only ghosts you hear about are the ghosts of Charles I. You don't hear about the ghosts of the charwoman or the ghosts of sort of lesser well-known characters, perhaps. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that, perhaps, because in lots of ways you're bringing back some of these less famous ghosts. You're giving a voice in this particular novel to a particular kind of of sidelined voice. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and about historical fiction for that.
Oh, well, I'm glad you picked up on that, because that not everyone has actually sort of spotted how important the ghosts were and the idea of ghosts turning to the novel. I was inspired by the fact that Harold Macmillan described Oxford as a city of ghosts after he returned he didn't return. He chose not to return actually after the First World War, because he found it too upsetting. And I wanted to sort of portray that idea that not just that the city was a changed place and that people there were haunted, but also that there were so many people that have been involved in the history of this university for 1,000 years, and then their stories are not all remembered, both male and female. And so I began to think about sort of ghosts and returning from the past quite a lot. And there are various characters in the novel who I don't want to give too much away, but they in a way return from the dead because their influence comes back out, or characters that we think are dead are not. And I tried to tie this up with the obsession of the time for bringing people back after World War I. So hence the Ouija board. And the Ouija board episode that happens in the first third of the novel is quite integral to the rest of the novel, because it gives each of them reads the word that comes up on the Ouija board in a different way. And for some of them it holds a secret, and for some of them it's a way of critiquing themselves. Others it's actually about someone who's connected to them. And I quite like the idea of touching on this spiritual realm that a lot of academics, especially the women from my research, were interested in post-war, and tying it up with the idea that so many people have gone before fighting for justice in so many ways whose stories aren't told. And I wanted to allude to a lot of what the first women at Oxford, or what had happened to bring these women there, the 60 years that comes before, the stories that aren't told. They are being told now. And one of the reasons I found out about Annie Rogers, who's one of these women, is that I saw a blue plaque up on St Giles when I was walking around Oxford that celebrates the fact that she was involved in that fight. But otherwise, she's an unknown character, yet she's integral to that enormous change that happened in Oxford. And of course, because that change happened in Oxford, it was on the front page of every newspaper, so it impacted the whole country. The Queen Mary, came along, and this visit is recorded later in the novel, and received an honorary degree. And you can imagine what that meant. If the Queen was receiving a degree, it was the stamp of saying that it's okay for women to go to university. They're not going to, they're not old maids if they do. So, I was trying to celebrate and recognise some of these untold women. I think I've done justice to them. I'm not sure I've done justice to the serving women and to other classes that were involved in the university at that time. But I think that I found that if I brought in another layer, the novel was getting so big and the characters would have suffered as a result. So.
And it would have been another book, I think, wouldn't it? Because it's a book that, in as much as it's doing all of these really exciting, important political things, it's a book that's about friendship, and it's about female friendship and sort of coming of age and growing up and recognising yourself. And there's obviously this whole historical circumstance which is taking place around it. But actually, at its core, it's those four young women sort of coming to terms with themselves and coming to terms with the world. And I think that's what's so superb about it, actually, in the sense of sort of being so evocative of that time. I did want to ask you about how you established that, because I think that even the way that they talk and the way that they move and the way that they seem to, the attitudes that they have, is so much imbued with the feeling of that time. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Was that reading around? How did you immerse yourself?
I read quite a lot of novels that were published in, not set in 1920, quite a lot of novels that were published in 1920. So I could get a flavour for the language and the attitudes.
I think that you can hear them speaking through, and I think that's really wonderful. Did you read The Well of Loneliness?
I didn't. I read extracts, but I didn't read the whole thing.
You must read it. It's incredibly sad.
I discovered Persephone books, and I was often sent things by my mentor or by people that knew that I was writing the novel, who'd come across, there's a book, it's called Latchkey Ladies, but it's not beside me, so I can't tell you who wrote it, and that my mentor from Escalator told me about, and that was really useful too. So I would also look at, D.H. Lawrence or novels that were written at the time, novels that people wanted to read during the war that are mentioned in the novel, just to sort of get a flavour of what people were interested in reading, but also what they were talking about, but mostly the language that they were using. I also watched a lot of films that were set, and anything I could find that would really capture the 1920s. And I would take a little notebook as I was watching and then write down key terms. I was aware that I didn't want the language that they used to be too ornate, but I wanted it to be accessible to readers, but I also wanted it to have a nod to the 1920s. So yes, I found myself for quite a long time using the word fearfully and awfully in general language.
You were becoming a bit Otto.
I was, yes, rather.
But I think that's what gives it, I think that really sort of gives it an element of sort of authenticity, actually, and it sort of comes across quite well. I wanted to press on again this historical fiction, because I think that there's a real trend in historical fiction, and there has been for some years now, that female novelists in particular do use it to go back and recover lost voices. And I was wondering if you sort of saw yourself in that tradition. I mean, I note that the quotes on the book are from Sarah Waters and Tracy Chevalier. So you are part of that tradition. But I was wondering how much you'd read into that and thought about yourself as a historical novelist in that way.
I've always loved historical fiction. And if you asked me what my favourite novels were, or what, if I just looked at my bookshelf right now and read some names to you, I can see there's Hilary Mantel, Tracy Chevalier, Stacey Halls, Pat Barker, Sarah Waters. It's something that I choose to read. I love and prefer to read novels with really strong settings that are very, very immersive. I'll also read speculative as well, but I don't tend to be drawn to contemporary very often, because I quite like the strong world building that you get in speculative and historical. And so I always knew that that's the sort of novel that I wanted to write, the novel that I want to read. And I think I was certainly drawn to telling unknown stories. I didn't want to write a novel that had been written before. I didn't want to write a novel where the plot was so primary that I neglected perhaps the characters and the truth of their stories. So you won't find there's murders here. You won't find Otto, solving crimes or anything like that, because I wanted it to be true to the experience of the women at the time and to be almost a record of their experiences and what they'd achieved for women like me. And that is why I think that, you can read the novel and think, well, it's more a novel about character than it is about plot. It is quite subdued, perhaps, in terms of plot, some might argue, if you're looking for the sort of historical fiction where something dramatic happens on every page. But I felt that I wanted to be true, to the reality of what I was reading in the archives. When I read handwritten first-hand accounts of what it was like to be there in the 1920s, those are the women that I wanted, to be remembered.
And there's nothing like that archival experience of picking up those letters and sort of going through those experiences with someone who this actually happened to. I think did you feel a special connection to those women that you were reading about in those letters?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I felt like they could be me, give or take 67 years. Yeah, absolutely.
I think they start to become your friends a bit when you're in an archive. I wanted to draw on what you were saying about Pat Barker with a sort of final question, I guess, which is that what drew you to this period in particular? I know that you wanted to get into the first women at Oxford, but this is a very evocative period, isn't it, the First World War? Did it feel quite dangerous or difficult or complex to write about because it has this whole myth and memory around it, with which novelists like Barker have done so much to sort of build up?
Yes, I think so. But I never really set out to write a First World War novel. I set out to write about those first women at Oxford. And then as I started to research, I realised it was impossible not to talk about the influence of war in 1920. So I felt that I wasn't really setting the novel in France, and you won't see apart from, I think, one or two letters that refer to it, there is no mention as such, because the war work that the women undertake is in this country. So I think I would have felt far too intimidated by the greats like Pat Barker to actually attempt that. But I felt that I was writing a slightly different sort of novel.
But one that is still, I think, really conveys really very well how saturated everything is with the war, even just going out and getting on your bicycle.
Yeah, and in the same way, I wasn't writing about the Roaring Twenties either, because they haven't happened yet. So for me, this was it's a very strange, liminal, transitional time, where the war has just finished, and as you walk down a street, you see a brand new war memorial being constructed, and when you visit someone in a village, you see it's all there's a new war memorial there, and there's a earth that around the bottom that shows it's just been put in place. It's a world in recovery. I think that perhaps I was quite influenced by the post-pandemic world as well, the idea of the impact of something big on society and how lives change as a result.
Because we hoped that, I guess, after the pandemic as well, to a certain extent, didn't we? We hoped that there was going to be really substantial changes for the good, that we were all going to sort of get a bit better after it. And that, I guess, maybe remains to be seen. But I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about that turning point, isn't it? That's brilliant. So tell me about the title, The Eights.
It was originally called The Bee Orchids. And for those that have read the novel, you'll see that bee orchids appear a couple of times, and they're a motif for independent women. I was researching purple flowers and came across them. Purple flowers are quite a theme within the novel, because I was looking at the purple, the colour of suffrage, and purple, green or white. And the bee orchid sort of represents the four women that I write about. A bee orchid has 3 petals around the outside and a furry bee-like inside that attracts the bee to pollinate. But in Britain, the bee orchids don't need the male bee anymore, because they've learnt to self-pollinate. And for me, it was a symbol within the novel of these women that embrace each other and have evolved, and are so intelligent, because the bee orchid is described as being a highly intelligent flower, and have become independent as a result. So I did name the novel after that originally, but it's a bit of a mouthful. And when you say it to people, they sort of, I'm not sure if it's the letter B, and so it results in a lot of spitting to say the bee orchids. So.
But it's a beautiful title, and that's a beautiful reason. Oh, the bee orchid. You've got it in the cover though, haven't you?
Yes, they're hidden in the front cover. I got rather obsessed with them for a while and go spotting them every year now, and they grow locally to me, which is great. So that's another side angle of writing a book. I'm now obsessed with wild flowers, which I wasn't before. But anyway, the title of The Eights came because it was felt the title needed to be changed. And at the time, I was researching these corridors as opposed to staircases. And I knew that Otto's favourite number was 8, and I knew that I'd weaved a lot of 8s throughout the novel, so secretly. So I thought that would make a really good nickname for the group. And for those that have read it, you might have noticed that there are 8 flashback chapters. You might have noticed that Oxford has 8-week terms, that Otto is born on the 8th of the 8th, and so is someone else in the novel. A lot of the buildings are octagonal, some of the memorials are, and so is the Oxford Union Library. And so on and so on. And so it's a kind of idea that I thoroughly enjoyed playing with and weaving through the novel. It's a number that Otto loves because it's so perfect and has so many, so infinite in the way that you write it, and it's associated with good luck in China, fortune. So yeah, it felt right for a novel that was about moving on and about sort of taking ownership of your future and about hope. So I was really pleased with it.
It sounds almost like a secret society, the Eights.
Yeah,
that's their secret club.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I was told about the book, The Group, which I didn't know after I'd written The Eights. And when I read The Group, I felt I could see the parallels between the two. So by calling it The Eights, there's an echo to The Group as well, I think.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Joanna. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And I hope that I would highly recommend that anyone listening goes goes out and buys the 8 because it's so enjoyable. And I absolutely went through it, I think, in a weekend just about, because it's so easy to read and they're such lovely characters. So thanks so much for the book, Joanna, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the really interesting questions. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Lovely.
A huge thank you to Joanna Miller and Katie Cooper for sharing their time and insights with us. Don't forget to pick up a copy of The 8s from your local bookshop or library. If you have any questions or you just want to say hello, you can find us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Writers Centre or over on Facebook. You can also sign up to our newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk to stay up to date with all our latest news and opportunities. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to continue our work. If you'd like to help, you can make a donation by visiting the Support Us page on our website. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please do consider subscribing, leaving us a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps other writers discover the show. Thanks again for listening. Keep writing, and I'll see you next time on The Writing Life.